At the end of A Dance with Dragons in Jon 13, Jon Snow is famously stabbed by the Night's Watch shortly after hearing of the defeat of Stannis in the Battle of Weiss in the infamous Pink Letter. However, we then received a Theon sample chapter with Stannis alive and well, awaiting the attack of the Freys. So what on earth is going on? Did the Theon sample chapter happen prior to the events of Jon 13, or is the Pink Letter simply a lie? Now I will say it's often very difficult to align the timing of chapters as they happen hundreds of miles apart, and some claim that our author plays fast and loose with events. That said, our author actually does give us quite a few little clues about the passage of time. We have the moon, the arrival of ravens, common weather, and characters who move from one sphere to another. So based on what's written in the book, let's go back and try to figure all of this timeline out. Just a little note on this analysis, I'm assuming that the Westeros moon acts like Earth's moon. That is, it's a 29.5 day cycle, and I'm assuming that it takes 1 day for a raven to get from one given location within the north to another. So a good place to start in building a timeline around the Battle of Ice and Jon Snow's assassination is Stannis' taking of Deepwood Motte in the Wayward Bride chapter. When this event occurs, Asha observes that the moon is almost full, a moon that we shall call Full Moon 1. So, on day 1 of our timeline, Stannis takes Deepwood Motte about a day or two before Full Moon 1. Full Moon 1 occurring on, let's say, day 3. It's actually very difficult to determine that the moon is not full the day before. The first observable phase before a full moon is called a waxing gibbous moon, and this is usually observable 2 days before the full moon instead of 1. Now what's kind of convenient for this discussion is that our month of December 2017 aligns with this. December 3rd is a full moon, so we can reference this month to see the phases pretty easily. Now I'm focused on Asha's moon sighting because it aligns us with Jon at the Wall. You see, in Jon 7, Jon receives a letter from Stannis during a new moon, or at least a near new moon. This letter, the Deepwood Report, tells of Stannis' conquest of Deepwood Motte. So assuming that it takes 15 days for a full moon to wane to a new moon, Jon should receive the Deepwood Report on about day 18. So assuming Stannis sent the letter the day before, this means he was at Deepwood Motte at least until day 17. Now besides looking to the moon in this message, we actually have some other support that Stannis was lingering at Deepwood Motte until at least day 17. Down in Barrowton, we have some important events happening with Theon in the Reek 3 chapter. In this chapter, we find out that Ramsay has been hunting for 16 days. Now this is very interesting as Asha receives a letter from Ramsay the night of Stannis' conquest, which means Ramsay would have needed to send the letter before he left. So that was probably on day 0, the day before Asha received it. Which means the events of Reek 3 occur 16 days later on day 15. Now this actually lines up exceedingly well, because on day 15, the night of Ramsay's return feast, Roose claims that Stannis is still at Deepwood Motte. So again, we have confirmation that Stannis is lingering at Deepwood Motte at least a fortnight. And it's on day 15 that Roose announces his plans to marry Ramsay to a fake Arya at Winterfell. This is information that's in the Deepwood Report. Also during the feast, Roose announces that the Northerners will be marching in 3 days. So all of this makes sense. The announcement of the Winterfell wedding was on day 15. The Umbers and the Karstarks would receive their invitations on day 16. Stannis would then get that forwarded information on day 17, and Jon Snow would hear about everything on day 18. Things are surprisingly nice and tidy at this point. But then things get a little weirder. So we know Stannis receives information about the Boltons' move on Winterfell around day 17. And we are fairly sure of this based on Asha's near full moon sighting and the new moon of the Deepwood Report, and the timing is confirmed by Ramsay's letter and his return feast. But Stannis actually lingers at Deepwood a bit longer, and we know this because we receive an update on Stannis' progress around the time of Ramsay's wedding. And we know when Ramsay's wedding was. It was during a crescent moon. A crescent moon means at latest 7 days after the new moon when the Bolton forces left. Any later and the moon is no longer crescent. It would be a half moon or waxing gibbous. And we know the wedding can't be much earlier because the Boltons needed time to get from Barrowton to Winterfell. Now you may be wondering if the wedding could have happened on a different crescent moon. This is highly unlikely as the next crescent moon isn't until day 40, which would require Stannis to linger even longer at Deepwood, and would give Bolton forces too much time to get to Winterfell. Keep in mind the trip from Deepwood Motte to Winterfell is 15 days, and so Roose's forces wouldn't dilly-dally in Barrowton from the 15th to the 40th. They must have been confident that they would beat Stannis, which means they expected their trip to take fewer than 15 days. In fact, they expected it to be fewer than 12 days, considering they waited 3 before marching. The only crescent moon that fits this scenario is the one on the 25th day. Now yes, 7 days to get from Barrowton to Winterfell does seem like a short amount of time. I can only assume that there are better roads from Barrowton to Winterfell, and that everyone was on horseback. Now, as I said previously, we receive an update on Stannis' progress around the time of the wedding. He has recently left, he's a fortnight from Winterfell, and he still has good weather. Now we know that Stannis thinks his march is going to take 15 days, and we also know that the bad weather begins on the 4th day of his march. This means that if the wedding happened on day 25, Stannis likely left Deepwood Motte on day 23 or day 24, with the bad weather occurring after the wedding on, say, day 26. And we actually have a little bit of confirmation of this within Stannis' camp. One man claims that Robert would have been in Winterfell a fortnight ago with a 10-day travel time. One could interpret this as him claiming that Stannis lingered 24 days at Deepwood Motte before leaving, something that Robert would have never done. Nonetheless, the near full moon that Asha spies in the Wayward Bride chapter and the crescent moon that Theon spies in the Prince of Winterfell chapter tell us roughly when Stannis left Deepwood Motte, around day 23 or day 24, and then things get quite a bit more precise. Asha goes on to give us a very detailed account on how long Stannis' march is. On the 34th day of the march, they arrive in the Crofters' village, and they wait there 19 days until Theon and Tycho Nestoris show up. That's 53 days. This means that if Stannis left on, say, day 23, day 76 is Theon's arrival, more or less, with day 77 being the Battle of Weiss. Now, we can actually figure out the phases of the moon for this entire period of time. Day 3 would be full moon 1, day 32 would be full moon 2, and day 62 would be full moon 3. Day 77, the Battle of Weiss, is actually a new moon. Said a different way, if Stannis takes Deepwood Motte on December 1, a near full moon, February 15th would be the Battle of Weiss, and that's a new moon. Now, this is all well and good, but what does this tell us about Jon? Well, one thing that can align us with Jon again is the travels of Tycho Nestoris. We know that Tycho Nestoris is at Eastwatch by the Sea, about to head to Jon during a half moon. Jon receives a message from Queen Selyse during this half moon, and Tycho Nestoris is with her. And of course we know that Tycho ends his journey during a new moon, the Battle of Weiss. And we have a rough idea how long it would take Tycho Nestoris to get from Eastwatch by the Sea to the Crofters' village. The journey from Eastwatch to Castle Black is about 3 days, based on Janos Slynt's journey during the Battle of Castle Black, and we know it takes at least 18 days riding to get from the Wall to Winterfell. And we know that it takes 3 days to get from Winterfell to the Crofters' village. Plus, Tycho Nestoris made a pit stop at Deepwood Motte, and there's really bad weather. The point is, Jon's half moon needs to be something at least 24 days back from the new moon of the Battle of Weiss. This half moon is certainly not the one that occurred 1 week earlier on day 70, and it's probably not the one that occurred 3 weeks back on day 55. The moon that fits is the one 5 weeks back on day 39. This would make Tycho's trip 38 days, which is reasonable all things considered. But even if you chose the half moon 3 weeks back instead of the half moon 5 weeks back, it doesn't really matter. These two half moons are the only half moons that even approach making sense, and they precede the same full moon. Full Moon 3 on day 62. Now, Full Moon 3 is important as it's likely the moon of Alys Karstark's wedding. You see, the same half moon that Tycho leaves on is the half moon that Val leaves on to find Tormund. This all happens in Jon 8, A Dance with Dragons. Val tells us that she will return the next full moon. In fact, she's rather specific. She looks up at the moon and then says, "Look for me on the first day of the full moon." So Val is either leaving on day 39, giving her 3 weeks to return to Jon, or she's leaving on day 55, giving her 1 week to return to Jon. But it doesn't matter, the result is the same. Val is absolutely positively promising to return on day 62, Full Moon 3. Now, we don't actually have any confirmation that Val returns on Full Moon 3, but Jon never thinks about her being late either. And again, Val was rather specific. Look for me on the first day of the full moon. So Val ends up returning the same day as Alys Karstark's wedding. And it would make sense to have Alys Karstark's wedding on a full moon, as it's the brightest night, thus conforming with the beliefs of the Lord of Light. It's of course possible that Val was late, but how much lateness is reasonable for Jon not to freak out? A couple days? A week? The thing is, there was a bit of urgency to get Alys Karstark wed. But at the same time, the mountain clans were invited and attended. So we have to ask ourselves, despite being in a rush, what's a reasonable amount of time to give Old Flint and Old Nori to get to Castle Black? A week? 2 weeks? 3 weeks? Well, if Val leaves during a half moon during Jon 8, and we know Jon 9 only happens a few days later based on Tycho's travels, then Alicent's wedding would be 2.5 weeks after her arrival at the Wall. 2.5 weeks, a reasonable amount of time to allow for Old Flint and Old Nori to get to Castle Black. So everything does seem to be pointing to the fact that there was a full moon during Alys Karstark's wedding. It was bright to please the Lord of Light. Jon wasn't freaking out. We have Old Flint and Old Nori's travel times. And we have Val's very specific word. Everything points to the fact that Val was in fact on time, and we have no evidence that she was late. So we are fairly confident that day 62, full moon 3, is Alys Karstark's wedding. Well, actually, it's probably day 61, since this day looks like the full moon, even though it's not the true full moon. And Val did say the first day of the full moon, so either day 61 or day 62. And we're fairly confident that day 77, the new moon, is the Battle of Ice. Now at this point, you can probably see where this is going. The final Jon chapters all happen pretty close to each other. Only one day after Alys's wedding, Jon treats with Tormund, and only 3 days after that, Tormund crosses with his wildlings. And right after Tormund's crossing, Jon gets a letter from Hardhome. Now we don't have the exact amount of time between Jon 12 and Jon 13, but Jon is planning on leaving for Hardhome, and Hardhome is an urgent situation. We know in Jon 12 that Tormund was going to march to Oakenshield in 1 or 2 days, and then return. Oakenshield is the next castle over from Castle Black, and is perhaps a half-day ride. Nothing is firm on how many days have passed in the last chapter, but 2 or 3 days would probably be a good guess. At the end of the day, this means that the pink letter arrives between day 67 and day 69. But wait a minute, we know that the Battle of Ice was on day 77, and the pink letter claims 7 days of battle, plus there's 3 days to get back to Winterfell, then a day for the Raven. According to the pink letter, it should be day 88, not day 68. Even if we assume the 7 days of battle is an exaggeration, the Freys still need 3 days to return, plus we need a day for the Raven to make it to the Wall. That's still day 81. That doesn't match up at all. We're off by at least 12 days, nearly half a month. The Theon, Asha, and Stannis story is well ahead of Jon, not behind it. Now, admittedly, there are ways to go back to the timeline and push a few days here and there. Perhaps Stannis left a couple days earlier. Sure, perhaps the crescent moon that Theon saw was the day before. Fine. Maybe Asha miscounted. Maybe Val was late a couple days, and maybe Jon waited a couple more days at the end. It's just that it's exceedingly difficult to make up for between 12 and 14 days. And frankly, it's impossible if we believe 7 days of battle. Now I know a lot of this timeline talk can be dizzying, but you can also look at it like this. Stannis takes Deepwood Motte a couple days before a full moon, and Jon is stabbed about a week after a full moon. That means between conquest and stabbing, we have a couple months plus some remainder. Between 67 and 69 days. It's certainly not fewer than 2 months or 2 moon cycles because Stannis' march by itself is 53 days. And it can't be more than 2 moon cycles because no Jon chapter allows for that much time to have passed. In Jon 7, he hears of the conquest of Deepwood Motte, but he also picks up some wildlings, Woon Woon, and some dead bodies. In the next chapter, Jon 8, everyone is still unfamiliar with Woon Woon, Jon is still questioning those wildlings, and everyone is uncomfortable with the dead bodies in the ice cells. But this is the same chapter that Val promises to return by the next full moon, and it's only a week after the full moon that Jon is stabbed. Jon must be stabbed around day 68, and not, say, 98. But Stannis' march is 53 days by itself, possibly more. Even ignoring the 7 days of battle in the letter, we still would have 1 day of battle, 3 days of the Freys going back, and 1 day for the Raven. That's 58 days, which means Stannis would need to begin his march on day 10, which is a half moon. And that day contradicts Ramsay's 16-day hunt, and the moon contradicts the new moon of the Deepwood Report. So piecing everything from the timelines together, either our author has made some errors, or the pink letter is a lie. Now, many people already suspect that the pink letter is a lie. But what's interesting is to look at when the pink letter was actually sent. If Jon received the letter on day 68, that means it was sent around day 67. That's a good 10 days before the Battle of Ice, and in fact, it's days before Theon and Jaine's escape. Now this is big because the letter mentions Theon and Arya's escape. Whoever wrote this letter must have known an attempt was going to be made. So let's go back and see what was going on day 68, the day the pink letter was sent. So if the Battle of Ice happens on day 77, that means Theon must have escaped around day 73, which means Mor's Umber arrived outside of Winterfell on day 72, Yellow Dick was murdered on day 71, Aenys Frey's squire was murdered on day 70, and the first murder was on day 69. On day 70, Mance's spearwife Holly also approaches Theon about the location of the crypts. Theon immediately deduces that Mance and the spearwives want to escape the castle. Now this is pretty big. Around the time an escape plan is being put together, a letter is sent describing the escape, and the letter would explain why they suddenly started taking action against people in the castle. After all, they'd been in Winterfell for over a month. Why start killing people and planning an escape now? Morris Umber didn't start blowing his horn for days. Now, on the subject, many of you may say, who cares? The idea that Mance wrote the pink letter has been around for years, and this timeline just shows us that our author is messy and careless. Maybe, but it may also be the exact opposite. It may be that our author has been careful with the timeline and has been paying attention to the phases of the moon. And by looking to the moon, we can figure out something very interesting going on. You see, Jon was likely stabbed between day 67 and 69, so the pink letter was sent between day 66 and 68. And let's remember that the full moon is on day 62. Day 61 to day 63, it looks like a full moon. Now this is what's interesting. In the A Dance with Dragons epilogue down in King's Landing, we have Kevan Lannister murdered on the first day of winter, which is also a full moon. That is, somewhere between day 61 and day 63. We know that this isn't a later full moon because Tycho Nestoris mentions to Jon that the Golden Company has left Lys, and Kevan is hearing about the Golden Company's landing and conquests in the epilogue. Now quite notably, a white raven arrives from the Citadel, signaling the change of seasons. I'm focused on this white raven because back in A Clash of Kings, we hear that white ravens are a different breed and smarter than black ravens. The white raven played no significant role in our story with the coming of autumn, and it's likely the story will end completely before our characters see spring. This means that this changing of the seasons, winter, is the only opportunity in our story for these smarter white ravens to be part of the plot. Otherwise, they serve no function whatsoever. Now, Winterfell is a bit farther from the Citadel than King's Landing is, so we can figure that they would receive their white raven signaling winter a few days after King's Landing would. If Kevan received his white raven between day 61 and day 63, then Winterfell would receive their raven between day 64 and day 66, not long before when the pink letter was sent. Now, an arrival of a white raven at Winterfell is pretty convenient, as it would explain how Mance sent the pink letter. He got a hold of the white raven that was telling Winterfell that winter had arrived. The white raven would be smarter than a black raven, and perhaps could fly to the wall on Mance's command, and would be camouflaged when leaving in a snowstorm. Additionally, the arrival of a white raven also lines up with some lines that Melisandre says around the time that Jon is stabbed. She says that winter is almost upon them. Said a different way, a white raven is almost there. The other interesting thing about the timeline is where the Wildlings might be. If you remember, A Dance with Dragons ends with the Wildlings wanting to head to Winterfell to liberate Mance. But being weeks away, they seem irrelevant to the situation at Winterfell. Except with the timeline disparity, this might not be the case. If Jon is stabbed on, say, day 67, the Wildlings would be 10 days into their trip when the Battle of Ice occurs. The victors of the Battle of Ice would get back to Winterfell around day 81, when the Wildlings are 14 days into their trip. And the victors of the Battle of Ice would be going even slower if they were afoot. We are approaching an amount of time where hard riders could conceivably arrive and influence a battle at Winterfell. Our author loves to have late-arriving armies turn the tide of war. It's not out of the question that a few hundred wildlings on horses who have experience in winter weather could navigate the storm and be significant at Winterfell or, say, the Dreadfort. And this is the big takeaway here. The when of things does make a difference. And that's all on the timing of the stabbing of Jon Snow. Once again, I'm probably wrong about half of this. I know many of you were expecting a video on Qhorin Halfhand. That's still coming. That'll be the next Night's Watch video, I promise. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.